Illuminate. I would like to welcome you all to our third session, I believe. Yes, third session of our Embracing the Unnormal webinar series. So for today's topic is the understanding whether a new behavior will stick in the post-pandemic era. So before we start, warm welcome for everyone who's returning from our previous webinar and also for those first-timer. Hope you can be with us for the upcoming webinars as well. And so before we start the webinar, I would like to just do some housekeeping. So we will have around 30 minutes of the presentation, and then we will have a Q&A session for around 20 minutes. And for questions, please just address in the chat, use the chat function, and address it directly to me, and I will read out the question during the Q&A session. Okay. So before we start, I would also love to introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker is Dawn Herdman. She's our President Director in Illuminate Research, and she has over 21 years of experience and has worked across categories and types in Australia, Europe, and Asia, and she's also a member of British Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia. And for our second speaker is Rahmanto. He's the Strategy Director here in Illuminate, and he is a seasoned marketer with 17 years, more than 17 years of experience, and he has a keen interest in neuromarketing, behavioral science, semiotics, and cultural understanding, with experience in both client and agency side. I think that's all from me, and I'll hand it on to Dawn and Mas Haris. Start the webinar.
Thank you, Sophie. If I could just add one more thing on the housekeeping, if you could just put your microphone to mute, that would be helpful. Thank you. Okay, so Harris is going to share the screen. We're going to be sharing the presentation today. I'll take you through the first bit. As Sophie mentioned, we're going to be discussing about understanding whether a new behavior will stick in the post-pandemic era. Okay, next slide. So as we are aware, the global pandemic has affected how people live and how people behave in their daily lives. And this has happened at a very fast pace. So at Illuminate Asia, we really wanted to understand how people are coping and adapting to all these changes. And we want to make sense, help our clients make sense of it all. Those of you who joined the last two webinars will have listened to us talk about some of the work we've been doing in consumer work, and also looking in semiotics and cultural work to understand what are the changes that are happening as a result of the pandemic. I'll briefly touch on a couple of elements from those earlier webinars, but if you weren't with us for those, please do touch base. We have recordings on YouTube and Spotify that you can listen back to. But now we're at this stage, and we're actually also wondering, so what is next? What's going to happen next? So we're in a situation in Indonesia where the social restrictions are looking to be lifted in various parts of the country. So what are the behavioral changes that will last after this pandemic ends? How can we try and predict these changes, or which changes will last and which will not? And what do we need to watch out for when we're considering and planning for a longer term time frame? Okay. Next slide. Okay. Yeah, so those of you who joined our earlier first webinar, where we did some global and local work on understanding how consumers are being impacted, we found there was many ways that Indonesians are having fears and anxieties in how in the current situation. So we mapped these out, as you can see. I won't go through all of them in detail right now, but we see that they range from a community focus to a personal aspect, and then also functional versus emotional. You can click the build, Harris. And what we also looked at was understanding how are Indonesians coping with all these changes. So this is on the back of research conducted in the middle of the social restriction or the lockdown period when people weren't leaving from their house. So firstly, we can see that there are several behaviors that are happening. One is enhanced health and hygiene rituals. Another is a very close management of economy, so not spending much money, be very careful about how money is being used. Also, life has been transformed in terms of technology and how we use technology on our day-to-day basis. We also see people on a personal level coping with religion and spirituality, being experimental and looking for opportunities to improve themselves, looking for strategies to manage mental health. On a community or level, we're also seeing a lot of altruism, a lot of people helping, communities coming together, individuals helping others through the situation. And then also a focus on maintaining personal connections and managing close relationships. Okay, next slide, please, Harris. Okay, so now that we're at this point, the question really is, what will happen in the next phase after the social restrictions end? What are we going to see? How can we predict this? How can we make sense of this and make plans moving forwards? So first of all, can we learn anything from looking back at history? So we know this is not the first pandemic. This is not the first recession. Actually, one of the biggest pandemic in the last several centuries was the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919. In fact, it infected 1 in 3 people on the planet and killed 50 million. So it's actually been even bigger than this one so far. So what we saw when we look at this is that the prevention measures is quite similar. So they had social distancing and isolation and quarantine. They had a more focus on personal hygiene, people using masks and all these sorts of things. And when we look at what changes happened and what change in behavior continued and which didn't, what we can see was there were some changes long-term. One was it transformed public health. So there were many countries that developed a health system or more stringent health systems. We saw that it contributed to a baby boom. So there was a lot more babies born after this pandemic. And then we also see that there was also this idea of lost generation. In that pandemic, a lot of the middle-aged people were the ones who died. So the parents, so they were leaving, or productive age, so they were often leaving children to be raised by elderly or even to become homeless. But interestingly, there is less evidence that some other habits actually stayed after the pandemic. So, for example, once the fear subsided, once the government restrictions stopped, what we've seen through the history is that people were less stringent about personal hygiene, about social distancing. So in a lot of ways, life went back to normal. And actually we saw, the roaring 20s where it was an era of great optimism and fullness of life. So I think it's interesting just to take a lesson from history here. Okay, next slide. I'm sure a lot of you have been reading many articles in the media or blogs or experts around the world who are saying that there's been a lot of hype saying that this is going to be a new normal and the world is going to be forever changed due to this COVID-19. And I've just put a few snippets of headlines and magazine covers and so on. So at Illuminate Asia, we've been talking a lot about this and we agree there will be change. But we're questioning the extent of change and how long the change is going to last. Okay, next slide. So before we go into our predictions, or not our predictions, into our thoughts on how we can predict and move forwards, I just wanted to touch base on some of the predictions that we're reading about. Now, I know some of you will already, will have read about some of these, have talked about these with your team members, with your family and friends, but I just want to touch base on some of them now. The first one is about tech dependency. So there is a prediction that we in Indonesia, but in the global scenario, will be a lot more dependent on technology in all aspects of our life. So from remote working, to remote learning, to telehealth, to how we interact with others, so socializing via video chat, entertainment, gaming, even things like online classes, fitness and wellness and well-being, and accessing digital media. So I think that's one very strong prediction. Number 2 is around e-commerce. So obviously we've seen a massive rise in e-commerce due to the social restrictions and policies around the world and also in Indonesia. So the prediction is that there will be an ongoing dependence on online shopping, on home delivery, and this will in turn affect the way the face-to-face retail environment is. So some of the smaller merchants may close down or disappear, or even some of the malls and shopping areas will change. Another one is localization. So there is a sense of this idea of enhanced patriotism, which is occurring and is predicted to continue to occur. So people will be interested to buy and support local businesses, local products, looking more into sustainable products, looking more into continuing this enhanced sense of community and a decrease in individualism. Another prediction is around changing lifestyles. So we've spent a lot more time at home, of course, and the prediction is that this will continue. So there will be more sharing of home duties. There will be more home-based leisure activities. We've seen a rise in cooking. There'll be less travel, or if it is travel, it'll be more localized. Less traffic, less need for people to get dressed up in formal clothing even. The next one is health and hygiene, which is quite obvious one, I guess. The prediction is that there will be more money spent and time spent on preventative products. So things like even cleaning products or hand washing products. Also more focus on cooking and nutrition and on vitamins and jamu. And then finally, the prediction is a more trust in experts. So a return to faith of experts, more seriousness, a respect for science. So we're not really here to throw in more predictions, because I'm sure you've heard, you've been reading it and heard a lot yourself as well. But we really want to help, or to understand, to help marketers how we can analyze which behaviors may last and which ones won't, because at the moment we're all in the same place thinking what's going to happen next. Okay, Harris, next slide. So why can't we be 100% confident with all these predictions and just expect it to turn out the way that various people are saying? So we have several reasons. I'm going to take you through the first one and then hand over to Harris to take you through the second and the third. So, but the first one is that we can't be sure how the COVID-19 recovery will progress. So it might not be linear. So when I say COVID-19 recovery, I don't mean just about the number of cases and the illness. I mean also all the factors that are surrounding this pandemic. So the social factors, the economic factors, and so on. Number two is that we can't trust consumers' claimed intentions for future behavior. So we can't just take their word for it, basically. And Harris will go through and explain why this is and how we can get around this. And number three is that we really need to take context and situational factors more into account. And Harris is also going to explain to you about certain theories that discuss about how sometimes we don't always take enough notice of some of the context. Okay, next slide. So the first one is around the progress of the COVID-19. So it's pretty clear, or it's pretty clear to us at least, that it's not going to be a matter of the social restrictions finish and then we're back to exactly how it was, yeah, or we're back to a new normal, perhaps. We are expecting there's going to be various phases, and actually, when you look at it on the left-hand side there, show you just a couple of the predictions. When we've been reading the literature, there's many different organizations and academics who are predicting what's going to happen next, and it often goes through this kind of following the pandemic curve of cases of COVID-19, as you can see there on the left. So mostly it's about, once we're into this kind of withstanding phase or this resilience phase, then we start returning or emerging into some kind of normalcy or a reformed normalcy. So, but on the right-hand side of this chart, we actually picked up on one model that we actually are quite interested in and wanted to discuss some aspects with you. It's by Professor Mark Ritson. Now, what he's saying is actually he's putting it into three phases. So the first phase is the COVID crisis. So this is the phase that we are in now currently in Indonesia and in most parts of the world. Now, this is how long this lasts, we don't know, but this is when there's a real crisis phase. So it could be 3 months, 12 months, or whatever. And then he says the next phase, which is something that he calls the false pneuma stage. So pneuma is a word that actually means a breath of fresh air. So what he's saying here is that this will be a period of elation, a time when everybody talks about how much the world has changed, how much the world has been transformed because of our experiences of this virus and of this pandemic and everything that surrounded it. So for example, people may be talking about everyone's going to become more health conscious and everyone is going to continue to connect and live more digitally. So I've had discussions with people around, talking about everyone's going to work from home from now on, or we're all going to keep our Zoom catch-ups with our friends and our family and things like that. But Professor Mark Ritson also claims that this stage won't last long. In actual fact, there is a global recession coming, we know that, and it will arrive, and then people will go out of this false pneuma stage and we'll see the old habits starting to return. So I guess the point here is that we don't really know what's going to happen. We don't know which predictions of these stages is going to be correct, or how the stages are going to look or feel and how they're going to be different. But we predict that there might be some switching backwards and forwards in and out of different stages. Things might change along the way. So we really need to be agile, and we need to look at the cultural changes that are happening and the consumer behavior that is happening as we go through these various different stages. Okay, now I'm going to hand over to Harris to take you through the next two areas in particular.
Yeah, thank you, Dawn. Okay, the second part is actually that why we cannot be too optimistic about predictions is that because consumers are not good predictor of their own future behavior. So there were past studies that proves that actually us as humans, we are lacking our ability to predict things. So there are a lot of studies there. For example, like people overestimate the likelihood that they will have long and happy relationships. So good luck with that if you expect to have that kind of things. And a lot of things like they overestimate on their ability to save things for the future, for personal finance, giving charity, and so on. So there is no reason for us to believe that right now people can also predict their ability or predict their behavior after the pandemic situation, because apparently we are not a good predictor of our own behavior. So this is a good example. The left one is if you know, or if you have lived through the 90s, like me, we had mad cow disease in UK around 1992. So it was quite bad. Many cattle were dead, people were infected, and even some fatalities. So sales of beef dropped by 40%. And also one research showed that 60% of consumers at the time said that they will not eat beef anymore because of fear of mad cow disease. But apparently within 6 months after the end of the crisis, the beef sales in the UK returning to normal levels. Because why? Eating beef is a strong part of the British culture. So apparently 60% people who claim that they will not eat beef anymore, just within 6 months they started eating beef. The second one is before the launch of first iPhone. You know that Apple is not a believer of this kind of studies of future intentions. So there is this one magazine who ask around consumers around the world whether they are interested in a phone that converge multiple devices like phone, music, and camera. So the finding was that people in more developed countries like US, they were not interested in this kind of phone, while people in the more developing countries like us or in India are more interested in this kind of phone than in people in the more developed countries. But apparently when this product was launched, of course, it was a sellout. Yeah, many people are waiting outside the stores and stock shortages were reported within hours. So again, there is a lack of predictive capability when you ask about consumers' future intention on their own behavior. And the third reason why we cannot take the prediction at face value, because we often misjudge the cause of behavior of other people. So if you look at this article, yeah, you've seen the article of people violating the social restrictions, PSBB or PSBB in Jakarta. So question is, why do you think this person violated the social distancing rule? So when I ask people around, or when we have this discussion in WhatsApp group and so on, usually the first response is because this person can be because he is ignorant, careless, or selfish, that doesn't care about the well-being of others and so on. So when we see this kind of behavior, we tend to attribute this behavior to the personality or to the character. So while actually this behavior is mostly affected by the situation. Maybe this person needs to go outside to work to make a living, which is actually more on the situation or on the context. But there is something called fundamental attribution error. So we tend to make mistakes that whenever we see someone's behavior, we attribute the cause of the behavior to the character or the personality of the person itself, instead of the situations that influence the behavior. Which brings me to this question, yeah. As marketers, do we also suffer from fundamental attribution error when we judge other people's behavior or our consumers' behavior? Because when we do research, marketing research, usually we put a lot of focus on the internal factors, yeah, such as we do usage and attitude study. We try to understand consumers' belief, values, consumers' attitude. We often think that the reason behind the purchase behavior is because the consumer's personality traits. We think that if we match the personality of the consumers with the personality of our brand, then there might be a higher chance for these consumers to buy our products. So we need to understand that when it comes to behavior, there are two different factors come into play. The first one is the internal factors, which is the belief system, the personality, the values, and the attitudes of the consumers. The second is the external influence, which is the situation or the context and the culture itself. So we usually do focus in understanding the first part, the internal factors of our consumers when we analyze the behavior. We need to put more focus on the external influence of situations and culture, because many studies have proved that more realistic self-predictions actually they actually involve situations or contexts, yeah, and there are times that attitudes alone cannot be used to predict the behavior. So I will give you one example here. When we try to predict behavior, yeah, usually we look at we try to explain by looking at the attitude. So, for example, based on the previous article, this behavior of I go outside during quarantine even though the government told us not to. So this is the behavior that we see happening out there. But if you look at the attitude towards COVID-19 by many persons, the attitude is that they are afraid that COVID-19 can be dangerous for me and my family. So there is some disconnects here. There is a missing link, because this attitude is actually not translated into the behavior. Because usually we believe that if people are afraid that COVID-19 affecting our own health, then the behavior is that we will not go outside. Yeah, we will remain at our house. So there must be something else come into play when we try to understand the link or the reason behind this behavior. The first one is maybe because there are other attitudes or competing motives, such as, to explain this, that traditional remedy is good to fight COVID-19. So if I drink jamu, for example, then I think I am building a good immunity so I can go outside. Or that washing hands and wearing masks should be enough for me. So even though I'm afraid of COVID-19, I still have the gut to go outside and work. But we should also take into account the external factors. Yeah. The first one is situational influence. Maybe the person see the situation that the job that he has requires the person to go out on the road to make money. Another factor can be cultural influence. Yeah, there are people who try to rationalize by saying that, in my belief, life and death are in the hands of God. or by saying that there is no punishment anyway for going outside during quarantine, because reward and punishment is definitely part of the cultural trait. And also another cultural factor is like mudik is a very important ritual that I will not miss. So when you look at this whole picture here, we see that when we try to explain the behavior, it's not enough just to connect this behavior with one attitude, because we will see the missing link and inconsistency there. There are many research in the past, such as by Rokic and Wicker. They find it difficult to connect or to find the correlation between attitude and behavior. So in order for us to understand the behavior, we need to factor not just one attitude, but multiple attitudes. So as you see in this internal area, but also we need to take into factor situational influence. So this is one of the study that is being conducted by Rokic in 1968. And I also add cultural influence here, even though it's not in the studies before, because looking at from the semiotics point of view, I think cultural influence also play a very strong influence on the behavior. So also when we try to measure attitude, there are problems in measuring it, because there is something called social desirability bias, where people, when we try to interview their attitude, they will tend to respond or to answer to this kind of question in ways that is considered as socially desirable. So they will try to answer based on what is accepted by the society instead of answer based on their own attitude or personal attitude. So there is also a gap in that sense. Yeah. And also most research only focus on one attitude, such as shown here. So on the way forward, yeah, what should we do? What should we do? And we see so many predictions going into our inbox. Yeah. First, that we need to take predictions with a grain of salt. Yeah, we need to take prediction very carefully because for every prediction that impacts our category, we need to make sure that we understand the attitudes and situations that come into play. And the second one is that we need to create a checklist to map the attitudes and situations to understand whether the behavior, the predicted behavior, actually congruent or consistent with the attitudes and the situations. Second one, what should we do is we need to track down the phases. We need to understand that consumers behave differently in each phase. Like Don said, there is this COVID-19 crisis, the false NUMA, and the recession stage. Within each phase, people behave differently because the situation change along the phase. So we need to make a situational scenario for each phase to make sure that we can validate which behavior is useful for us to understand during the phase. The third one is we need to keep on tracking the contextual or situational changes to predict the behavior more accurately. So we need to use the right methodology to understand the consumer context or consumer situations. And we need to use this new information to update our situational scenario that we have developed in the second way forward. I'll go through one by one. So the first one is taking predictions with a grain of salt. So this is a simple checklist that you can do. Yeah. So we need to understand what is the underlying attitudes and the opposing attitudes, and also the situations to assess whether this prediction of behavior will last after the pandemic. So one case that we have conducted through IDI and past focus groups with consumers at the pandemic. Of course, there is this shift to online grocery purchase. People start to buy vegetables, fish, any fresh goods online. The question is that is this behavior will continue to do so in the future? Yeah. So we don't want to just throw the prediction that now that consumers are buying fresh goods online, they will keep on doing it in the future. We need to have this sanity check, so to speak, yeah, to understand whether this will last. So first question is, what are the attitudes that might drive or oppose the behavior? First is that COVID-19 increased my concern towards my own health and my family. This is the first attitude. That's why they start to buy things online. But they actually prefer to buy fresh goods in market, wet market, or tukang sayur, because they can choose the product themselves. They can bargain also. And also that there is this notion that traditional market has the freshest products and they have complete assortments. So there are different conflicting attitudes. One will definitely win over. How can we see that one attitude actually has the most correlation with the behavior? You just look at the behavior, whether the consumers finally buy the products online or not. So second one is the situations. What kind of situations that drive or oppose the behavior? The first situation is the government imposed social restrictions and some markets are closed. So consumers are forced to buy things online, including the fresh produce. And then access to technology, of course, whether they have smartphones or payment system, and also their view on the severity of COVID-19 pandemic and their ability to face risk, yeah. And then the next one is availability of other options, whether there is vegetable vendor in the neighborhood still, or whether there are access to traditional markets by these consumers. And then the other situation is cultural factors, that buying groceries, buying fresh produce is part of social ritual, of course. Housewives buy groceries or vegetables not just because of necessity, but also part of their socialization with the neighbors or people in the neighborhood. And then we can use another checklist whether they are satisfied or not towards the current behavior of online grocery purchase. So there are satisfying factors and non-satisfying factors. Maybe they are not satisfied because they cannot control the quality of the fresh goods. It is more expensive, have a long delivery time, hard to find the right apps. It takes longer to order online than to go to the nearby vegetable vendor. They are satisfied because the safety is guaranteed because they don't have to go outside. So there are different things that may drive the behavior in the future. Depends also whether they are satisfied or not with the current solution. Otherwise, they will go back to the other solutions that they think is more convenient or more satisfying. And then the next question is, what would the future situations be once this current situation is over? So it can be that people will go out and about when the restrictions are lifted, and then traditional markets will reopen and availability of online groceries will return to normal, which means that people now have more choices. So this will challenge our prediction that consumers will keep on buying fresh goods in the future online. But there is also the future situations, future scenarios that there is a possibility of second wave of pandemic. So by making this kind of map, this kind of checklist, we can try to assess whether the prediction of people keep on buying online fresh goods after the pandemic, is this going to be valid or not? Of course, it is based on judgment, but by weighing this kind of attitudes and situations, we can try to see that I think many people will go back to normal once the pandemic is lifted. Because if you look at the situations, you look at the attitudes of the consumers and how satisfied are they with the current solutions, it seems that they are still longing to go back to buying grocery or fresh produce offline or face to face. So this is one way to take the predictions and test the predictions to see whether it is relevant or not. Second one is we need to track down the phases. Yeah, so we need to conduct workshop to develop scenarios to see for our own category what could happen for each potential phases and what are the situational scenarios that might happen. So this is a toolkit for us to predict the behavior. So we need, I'm using the Mark Ritzen's framework. You can just use any other framework, but I find this one as the most relevant for us. So there are three phases: the COVID crisis, the false pneuma, and the recession. So we can make a different scenario. And then, for example, the first one is the COVID crisis is short for just for 3 months. The period recession is short and there are no second wave. We can make the second scenario of medium COVID crisis, like 6 months, a medium recession period without second wave, and so on. So we can develop different scenarios. And for each scenario, we can put what is the situation for this scenario. So for example, if the COVID crisis is short here, what is the scenario for the COVID crisis? Because it is short, maybe people tend to maintain this behavior temporarily. Once it's finished, then they will go back to normal before we enter the recession, for example. And then we can predict the behavior based on the situations. And it can be different situation when the COVID crisis is longer or the recession is longer and so on. So this is an easy toolkit for us to try to predict the consumer behavior in the future for our specific category. So I recommend this to be done for each of your category, not for a broad understanding of the consumers, because I think the behavior of consumers is different for different categories. And also to enrich the input for this kind of workshop, we should consider before doing this workshop to do some situational research, to do some cultural analysis, also to see case studies from other countries who might have went through the phase, and also to look at macroeconomics indicators to see which kind of scenario makes more sense. And once we've done this scenario mapping, it's very important for us to keep on tracking the situation and the context to predict whether the behavior that we listed in the scenario happens or not. So again, we always suggest that we focus on context, as much as we focus on the audience itself. When you do internal research, research to understand the internal factors, usually you do research such as values, attitudes, perceptions, or research on personality or psychographic studies. But we recommend that, especially when we try to understand the future behavior of our consumers, we also do research that focus on understanding the external influences that affect the consumer's behavior. We can do ethnography, for example, and also we can do a research called situational interview or jobs to be done. We've done this so many times in the past, and I think jobs to be done or situational research can explain way deeper on the consumer behavior than just understanding the consumer's personality. So let us know if you want to talk more about this methodology, because I will not go deeper here. It's another webinar just to explain, yeah. And also we can do semiotics or cultural studies, because again, there are two things in the external influence, the situation and the culture. So we need to make sure that once we have assumptions about the future behavior, we need to recheck the assumptions. We need to update the scenario by monitoring these external forces that influence the behavior. So the suggestion is to research more often. No need to be like a full scale or major scale research, but we need to make sure that what we predict, we can track down and we can also revise our scenario. So over to Dawn for the closing statement.
Okay, thanks, Harris. Great. Okay, just to wrap things up, this is very changing and difficult times at the moment. This is in an era that we're not seen in the past. So predicting consumer behavior is even more challenging. As Harris outlined, there's been many research done in the past about the correlation between attitude and behavior and so on. But I think it's even more critical right now to keep on top of this. And it's more critical for businesses and marketers to really get it right. So can you just build the slide, Harris? Yeah. So I think we wanted to, with our presentation today, we really wanted to start a discussion point and give a point of view and give you really a thought piece on the types of research or the types of questions that we need to be looking at right now. Obviously, it's important not just to rely on what consumers say themselves that they will do or how they will behave in the future. As marketers, we need to avoid the temptation to put too much weight on researching internal factors, personality, attitudes, and so on when we make predictions. And we need to shift our mindset and utilize a range of tools and methods to ensure that we accurately develop and test a range of scenarios, as for example, as Harris just outlined in the previous couple of slides. So I think we really, by doing this, we can be more ready to adapt to the upcoming changes, ensure we're more prepared to navigate through these. And Harris has touched on in the last slide some of the methods that we are using, and hopefully this session today has given you a starting point of thinking about how we can work together, or how you can think about in your own organizations of how to figure out what's coming next and how our consumers will be adapting, will be changing. So thank you very much for your time in the presentation. Harris, if you go off the share screen, we'll put the video on. Actually, what we'd like to do now is open up for questions. I think Sophie was collating the questions for you, but while she's just doing that, I wanted to again say thank you very much for joining. This is part of a ongoing series of webinars. So we've already done a couple and there will be more to come. So we will be, we'll be touching base again and sending out more information about that. So handing over to Sophie to see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Dawn, and thank you, Mas Haris. So far, there are no questions yet, so please don't be shy and give me your questions. Okay, I have one from Nataya Bagia. Is there a study also on consumers' behavior in ASEAN? I'm curious whether there's a comparison.
Okay, I'll just jump in and let Harris finish up. There have been some studies already at the moment around claimed behaviours in this pandemic era, and some of those were included in some of the predictions that we've put into this particular presentation. So in terms of what the behaviours, how the behaviours would look. I think in terms of the academic studies, I think a lot of them are from abroad, but I'll just check with Harris if he's come across any kind of localized academic research studies in this field.
I haven't come across it, but I mean, if we are actually part of this initiatives called Not Everyday Life. Yeah. So if you follow our first webinar, we can share also the material. It is a global effort to understand the consumer's behavior during pandemics and post-pandemic. So it is an ongoing study. So there are, I think, more than 100 researchers across the world who did this study. And we, us in Illuminate, we do this for Indonesia, Malaysia. I think we also have our partners in other agencies who do studies in Philippines, yeah, Malaysia, many other countries. So if you want to understand the Southeast Asia context, I think just stay tuned with us because we will share the next study of Not Everyday Life sometime soon, because we are now still at the fieldwork stage. I think we have more contributors and more respondents this time for the second wave.
Yeah, correct.
I think we have questions directed at my account. So instead of to Sophie, but anyway, I'll just read it out. So from Prima, culture and consumer behavior may change over time, driven by situation, but some may be harder to change. Like nawar di pasar culture is kind of irreplaceable experience that will drive go to pasar culture back too soon. Yeah, I agree. So culture is something that is that changes gradually, yeah, most of the time. So I forgot the title of the book. I think there's a book called Cultural Code where there is something called hard culture and soft culture. So hard culture is things that you see in the pop culture right now, which is changing very quickly, like the Dalgona coffee and those kind of hypes. Yeah, that's the hard culture. But there is something called the soft culture that is more silent, but it's actually lasting over time, like this nawar di pasar culture, for example. So yeah, I agree that this kind of culture may stick still, even though right now people don't have the luxury to go to the wet market yet. Yeah. Any additional thoughts, Dawn?
No, I mean, I think that's correct around the culture. But one thing I just wanted to add in is that one of the things that we do at Illuminate Asia as one of our, I guess, more unique aspects is that we are very much involved in cultural analysis and cultural studies on an ongoing basis. And we've been doing that for many years. So by doing that, we're looking at the short term and the longer term kind of changes that are happening. And, our agency is almost 10 years old. And across that time, as Sarah said, you see lots of trends, like especially food and beverage, loads of trends happening. And we presented in webinar 2 around some of the cultural changes in food and beverage in the pandemic. But we have also noticed a lot of longer term shifts, and they might be smaller shifts, but still we can see directions across time. So I think it's a matter of, in all the work that we do with our clients and internal work as well, is that we always keep those longer term studies that we're conducting in mind as well.
Yeah. I have 2 more questions actually. So Sophia, sorry taking over your role as moderator. So
Yeah.
Next one is from Fanny Melana.
No problem.
How far or how big consumer social economy status or condition contribute on the behavior during or after this pandemic? Okay, you want to answer that, Dawn?
I can. I mean, I think so. So the question was how much is the social economic factors going to impact on behaviors? I mean, obviously, one of the key predictions across the world, and particularly Indonesia, is around the recession. So already we see a lot of economic impacts from the pandemic and from the social restrictions. But the prediction is that once life gets a bit more normal, people are moving around again, that there will still be an ongoing global and local recession and crisis, and economic crisis. So obviously that will be one of the situational, contextual influences that will hugely impact various social classes in different ways. So obviously the middle and lower social classes will have a lot of heavy impact on that. One of the predictions, again, we're questioning predictions here today, but one of the predictions is that, for example, luxury goods the sales of luxury goods might go down because people can't afford that, or perhaps it could be discretionary spending and things like some entertainment that could perhaps dip is another prediction. So absolutely. And I think that's another thing when we go through and we look at the different contexts and analyze situations and the phases, we have to take that into account as well, of different types of consumers that we have.
Yeah. And I think the one way to test predictions is to see whether similar situations happened in the past. Pandemic, not so much, but recession, we've seen this many times, like 2008, or Indonesia is 1998. So we can actually learn from the past events to see similar things happening, like like spending on luxury goods in 2008 definitely went down, or in 1998. So if people predict that it will happen again, I think we have seen the case in the past that have proved that situation happening. And then from Lichi Imansyah, Mbak Lichi, when do you think the best time to do the prediction workshop, as close to the normal? We don't know what normal is right now, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think when we talk about prediction workshop, it's actually to help us to map out the scenario, so to make sure that we can anticipate the situation in the future. So it's better to do it now, and then we test the prediction along the way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we just keep on chasing tails when it comes to research.
Yeah, no, I also agree there, Harris, that I think now is a kind of a critical point, because we've been in this social restriction for quite some time, and there is a lot of discussion about coming out of it, and things will change. I predict fairly quickly, but I think it's going to be an ongoing process as well. So I think it is about doing the workshop, but then always touching base and re-looking at things and reconsidering as we move through this process, which it could last some time. The different phases that we're talking about, it could be most people predicting at least into next year, if not longer. So I think it's a matter of setting up a timeline to kind of keep checking back in on how things are and how things are moving.
Sophie?
You have more? Oh, sorry. So this is from Claudia Susana. do you think there will be a difference between generations in terms of how the habits will stick? So, for example, boomers versus millennials versus Gen Z.
I thought actually, I think the generational segmentation is rubbish in a way that you talk about millennials, which is like a billion people across the world and so on. So I think it's not about in what year you were born, but it's more about, you know, even within millennials, there are segments. Within boomers, there are segments. Within Gen X, there are segments as well. So it's not as easy as to say that this is the behavior of the millennials. Last year, we had this client gathering. So we talk about Islamization of brands, how brands are becoming more Islamic in a way to grab the Islamic consumers, where we see that even the millennials are getting more and more conservatives in their way of thinking. But of course, not all millennials are more conservative, right? So we also see another trend of what we call the overlooked generations. If you see ally generation is also the opposite of this more conservative generations. They came from the same age group, but they have a totally different behavior because again, there are influences in internal and the external factors that shape these generations.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to jump in, I agree. Absolutely. It's not just about generations. One area that I'm particularly interested in personally as well is understanding the older generation though, because I just think I've seen examples of some older people, and I'm talking probably my age and above. I don't know if I classify as old yet, but that they were really, and I think of my parents' generation and so on, they're really hesitant about using digital media and anything digital. And now because of the pandemic, they've become forced to use some of these materials and some of these methods. So I think that's an interesting case study to see what will happen with that kind of, maybe we say 50s plus years old people, whether they'll become more digitally savvy and how that impacts their life. We don't have the answers yet on that one, but
but actually that's the situation forcing them to adopt. So it's not about that characteristic, it's more about the situation that puts them in the situation to adopt the digitalization.
Yeah, correct. So the question is, given another situation, will they continue it on? Do they see enough benefits in certain behaviors in order to do that? So, yeah.
Our next question is from Triandika Ramadan. For some, the methods mentioned can be challenging as we could not be too sure about our assumption. And sometimes we did not have the time and resource to keep conducting our internal resource, even using the set tools. So another approach is to monitor the likely behavior that may appear in the general public, so not specific to our category, and then adjust our activity to cater to that new behavior. So does Illuminate already done research or have observed some attitude or behavior that are emerging in the general public during this new normal?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just jump in on that. We have, I mean, some of the work that we've already been presenting in some of the earlier webinars looks at this. And I think one of the points that we're making in today's session is that it is, of course, you might not be able to run a separate workshop every single time something changes in the society and so on. But I think it's about, you know, keeping track of what's going on and looking at whichever sources you can do, including cultural studies, to try and understand what's happening in a broader sense. And then I think from a brand or marketer's point of view, you need to look at that and internalize and understand what that means for you and your business moving forwards.
Yeah, I think we've done 2 webinars, and even though the second webinar is more on the food and beverage area, some of the learning can be used for other FMCG products, for example. So yeah, I agree that if you don't have enough information about your own category, you can try to look at other categories or look at more general behavior.
Yeah, and so those of you, as I mentioned, those of you who weren't at the earlier webinars, when we'll send through details of this recording, and we'll also include from the last time, so you can go back and have a look at those webinars as well. Hopefully it gives some help. I have a question that's been addressed here to me from Prima Sukma Setiwan. It says, what's Illuminate's view on herbal products in the future relating to COVID-19 situation, especially immune booster herbal products? So I think I'm going to refer back to Harris in a second because he's been doing some specific work in this area. But I think this is one of the cases that we see that there's been a lot of discussion because of the pandemic around herbal productions, whether it's about vitamins or whether it's about jamu or whether it's about kind of natural products. What we had and what we see in the pandemic is there is this attitude and behavior around wanting to fuel your body and or give yourself the best possible chance to be healthy through this time. Yeah. So there's the thought that, you know, having herbal products or having healthy foods or having jamu and so on will help us as humans to get through this. I think just before I hand over to Harris, I think in terms of the next the future on this one, there's still a question mark and we still need to look into that. But what we have seen is that, you know, there has been a kind of a health trend happening in Indonesia for the last year. And part of that is included in understanding the naturalness and the herbal products as well. So, I mean, taking the pandemic out of the equation, I would expect that those sorts of product areas that would continue to perform quite well. But I'm going to be curious and see what Harris comments out, given his recent work in this area.
Yeah, I think immunity boosting category, even before the pandemic, is actually one of the fastest growing in supplements, I think. So the pandemic situations, again, it only boosts this category higher. So because this is I think I see consumers getting more and more defensive when it comes to medicine, for example. So they want to be on the safe side, afraid of the side effect and those kind of things. So for categories that is more defensive like this, I think it has a good potential to remain to be consumed in the future. Yeah.
So Sophia, are there any other questions? We are almost out of time, I think.
We'll have several more.
We're almost out of time, so maybe just pick a couple and then we
Yeah.
So this is from Mamilan. How to detect if there is a changes behavior towards flavor or fragrance consumption? What is the best tool to know?
Yeah. We did several studies actually using semiotics, cultural studies, to understand people's perception on or the culture towards fragrance, even towards color as well. So one of the study that we can do, Mamilan, to predict the future when it comes to fragrance and flavor is actually by doing some cultural studies. That's an alternative that I think very interesting to explore. Just we can discuss this personally, of course.
Okay, so this is interesting, I think, from Chico Septiani. So based on our current situation now that everything is going digitally, what is the best way or strategy how to approach audience who is still in the new adapter phase of digital and on what channel?
Okay, I think that's a really, really good question. And that goes back to the kind of the generational thing I was talking about, the new adapters. I mean, to be honest with you, this is an area we haven't done a lot of research in yet. And it might be an area that we pick up for another webinar because I think it's going to be super important moving forwards. But I think we see that with the new adapters that they're using a social media, looking in the news portals as well as consuming other digital media for entertainment. So things like Netflix and YouTube and so on. So I think it's about keeping it simple, keeping simple messaging and simple interactions with them.
Yeah, I think it's also about how far from normal the changes in behavior is. Like in Don's example of older generations who are forced to adopt digital. So if you say that this is the normal level, is it just a small addition to their behavior, or is it very far? Because if it's quite far, I think people will try to go back to normal as soon as possible. Yeah. Like Right now, you cannot go to movies, but it is something that you're really looking forward to. So once you can go out, maybe the first time you do is you watch movies in theaters or you eat out, because it is, this current situation is very, very far from normal. But if previously you are used to buy things online, but now you are forced to buy groceries online, which is an additional behavior, I think it's not that high of a deviation. So adoption to this kind of things may be easier for people who are already buy things online already for non-grocery purchase.
But I think it's something that we'll mark down to do some research into, because I think it's really, really interesting area. So thank you so much. Thank you for that question. It's a thought starter for us as well.
Last two. Last two. From Leo Mualim, do you think that big corporate behavior will change due to this COVID, internally and externally, or after the COVID, the old behavior will return?
Okay, big corporate behavior, was that?
Yeah, big corporate behavior.
Okay.
You mean like working from home, something like that, or?
Not
or
sure.
Advertising.
For example, BAU.
Business as usual.
Yeah, business as usual.
Yeah, I think it's well, it's a bit out of the topic. Yeah, we talk about consumers, but I think again, how far is it from normal when big corporations are very they put their structure upon working from the office, for example, then maybe it's going back to normal means that you start working from office again. Like us in Illuminate, we are quite used to working from home, so this is not something too strange for us. So after maybe even after the pandemic, we still consider to spend some time to work from home as well.
Yeah. So I think that's right. I think it depends on the corporate culture. But what we are seeing in other parts of the world as well is that people are getting used to working from home, and there are advantages for many people. If we're talking about this area, there are advantages. There's less commuting time. There's more flexibility. There's more time to do things like whether it's exercise or spend time with the family and all of that. So there are a lot of benefits. And I think I read something recently about this prediction about how workspaces will change. And there is something called I can't remember the term that they use it, but it's like when we talk about the digital divide, it's like the work from home divide, depending on things such as the home structure and socioeconomic factors. So this article that I'm referring to was discussing around that people who have living in perhaps larger houses or have more space are more likely to actually continue to work from home. But I guess it's one of those areas that we need to wait and see. But I personally, my personal prediction is that there will be enhanced flexibility in the ways that corporates work. It won't be 100% how we've been doing it in the last couple of months, but I predict that there'll be more flexibility. People have more options of working from home once a week or doing more virtual meetings and things like that, because there are benefits and practicalities as well.
But again, back to our framework, is about situations and attitude. So what's the attitude of the owner or BOD towards the situation? Yeah, and then again, what's the situation that forced us to change our way of working?
Yeah, correct. But some of the studies that I've been reading around this area is that actually people are seeing an enhanced efficiency from employees from working from home. So if the board of directors can see that things are happening and they're happening better, then they'll probably continue. But let's see. This is another area that's going to be interesting in the next few months.
I think the last question from Grayson is actually related to the previous question, so maybe just a quick affirmation. So this is different generation has emerged, and can we still learn from the past recessions as different generation may have different behaviors? I think that's related.
I think we covered that.
Yeah, I think behavior is something that is situational, contextual, and we can learn actually from the past situations and past context. So yeah, the answer is there are some lessons that we can use for current situation.
Okay, so that's all for the questions.
Yeah, still there is one actually coming to me.
Okay.
From Nanda Sukma, do you think product with higher SES consumer will have less impact because their consumer also have less impact in terms of economy. I think it depends on what the category. Yeah, like higher SES, maybe they go to movies quite often. They have the money, but situation force them not to go there. So doesn't mean that because you have a higher SES target that the category is not impacted. You see also like dining out, people can still afford to buy, like high-end restaurants foods, but they cannot go there anyway. So this dining out scene is actually quite struggling during this pandemic.
Yeah. So I also think it's the impact is relative. Yeah. So I think if we're looking at what's going to happen in the future and in the coming months with a recession and so on, I think obviously the lower social class is going to be very heavily hit, but also the higher social classes, I think there will still be impact. Yeah. So there will still be some level of kind of justifying what what is being spent on and what's being done as well. So I don't think we can just say all of the high social class will be able to do anything. Yeah, I think that's unrealistic. I think.
Again, look at the situation on your product. Even though it's targeting higher SES, doesn't mean that people will still consuming the products. Still, exactly. Again, what is the context? What is the situation?
Yeah, correct. Okay.
Okay, so that's the last questions.
Okay.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. And I think Don has mentioned before that we will be updating for the next webinar section, right? We will send the links and updates, invitation, and also you can find this session and the previous session in our social media, YouTube channel.
Yeah. We will also share it as well with you for the presentation. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.